Добрый день, уважаемые.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, distinguished guests. May I declare the session of the dissertation panel on the defense of Sonya Yampolskaya's dissertations and features of European Hebrew development in the 19th, early 20th century, loanwords and TV distinction. To call to order, may I remind you to switch off your mobile devices. Thank you. May I inform you that we have the audio-visual connection and online broadcasting on the St. Petersburg State University website, as well as simultaneous interpretation into English. First and foremost, may I note that according to the federal law, as of May 23rd, 2016, number 148, on the changes into provision 4 of the federal law on science and technical policies as of the 23rd/08/1996, St. Petersburg State University and Moscow State University were granted an exclusive right to grant academic degrees. At the same time, PhD granting in St. Petersburg and Moscow State University is possible only according to the list of specialties stipulated under the relevant decree of the Ministry of Education. Therefore, the procedure and the relevant decree on PhD granting procedure was issued as of September the 1st, 2016, number 6821/1. The present dissertation defense panel is the first in the university. It is the second after the first one, which took place several days ago. Therefore, my congratulations. May I inform you that the procedure of the defense panel meeting, according to the rule of procedure on PhD granting, candidate of sciences and doctor of sciences at St. Petersburg State Universities, is plenipotential, provided that it includes not less than 2/3 of the previously established composition. So it should be no less than 4 people, but today we have 5 members of the defense panel, but one of them is still on the way. I hope that this member of the defense panel will join us, but we have the quorum. 2 of the 4 present are in an online mode. According to point 19 on PhD granting of the above-mentioned decree, may I inform you on the following rules of procedure. The time limit is no more than 2 hours. First comes the short report of the chairman and information on the documents submitted by the defendant. Questions? Second, a short report of the defendant on the research paper and dissertation. Third, questions to the defendant on the report, no more than 2 minutes per each question. Those who want to ask a question, please tell your name and title. Then come all the reports that have been submitted to the defense panel, not over 10 minutes per each speaker. 5, general response of the defendant to the reviews, not over 15 minutes. 6, open discussion and all the contribution of the audience, those who and all non-panel members, with a short resume of their positions and proposals to the defendants, not over 5 minutes per speaker. All who would like to take the floor have to register in advance and introduce themselves before making the contribution. 7. General commentary of the defendant on the questions asked, not over 5 minutes. Speech of the research supervisor of the defendant, not over 3 minutes. 5 minutes break before the open voting on granting or non-granting of the academic degree, as well as the discussion of the members of the defense panel, which is not broadcasted. Next comes the open voting and the inclusion of the results of the vote into the protocol, as well as the conclusion on granting or non-granting of the desired academic degree. 11. The conclusive word of the defendant, not over 3 minutes. The dissertation by Sonya Yampolskaya on Features of European Hebrew Development in the 19th, early 20th century, loanwords and TV distinction has been accepted for defense as of November 21st, 2016, Decree 9250/1. And the composition of the defense panel is as follows: Oleg Redkin, Doctor of Letters, Professor, Head of Arabic Philology Department, St. Petersburg State University, Chairman of the panel; Alexander Zheltov, Doctor of Letters, Docent, Professor, Head of African Studies Department, St. Petersburg State University; Sergei Franzuzov, Doctor of History, Head Research Fellow, Head of the Near and Middle East Studies, Oriental Manuscripts Research Institute, Professor at Semitology and Hebraistic Studies Department, St. Petersburg State University; Arkady Kovelman, Doctor of History, Professor, Head of Judaic Studies Department at Institute of Asia and Africa, Moscow State University. 5th, Karen Dubnov, Doctor of Linguistics, PhD in Linguistics at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, Research Secretary at the Hebrew Language Academy, Israel. The defendant has submitted to the Expertise Center of St. Petersburg State University the following documents. Application addressed to the rector, Michael Kropochev, as of October 28, 2016. The report of the supervisor, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Head of the Semitology Department of St. Petersburg State University, Mr. Michelson. 3rd, list of papers published by the defendant, including those in the list of the Ministry of Education. 2 of them are included in Web of Science and Scopus databases. 4th, certificates and copies of diplomas on Master of Oriental Studies in Oriental Studies and African Studies of St. Petersburg State University, and the copy of the diploma under the program of Cultural Anthropology and the degree of Master in Anthropology. 5th, the certificate that proves that Sonya Yampolskaya has successfully passed 3 qualification examinations in English, languages of Asia, Africa, Aborigines of America and Australia, history of philosophy, passed with honors. The dissertation was submitted in Russian and in English, both electronically and on paper. The dissertation is written according to the existing Russian Federation standards. I should note that all the documents are in compliance with Provision 12, Section 3 on the PhD granting procedure at St. Petersburg State University. May I now give the floor to the defendant. May I remind you that you should not extend your time limit of 15 minutes. Distinguished members of the dissertation panel, dear colleagues and friends, 100 years ago, some limiting laws were abolished. The others at the same time were not there yet. But at that time, the culture in Hebrew has extended to a limitless scale. Thus, on the other bank of the Never River, there was Samson and Delilah performed. The daily newspaper in Hebrew was published. There were kindergartens, there were schools and gymnasiums where all subjects were taught in Hebrew. At the same time, there was a lot of debate on how to choose a national language, with Hebrew mentioned as a dead language, and therefore it was unfit as a national language. Therefore, this contradiction between what was there and what people thought about Hebrew are the subject of my dissertation, which is titled Some Features of European Hebrew Development in the 19th, early 20th century, Loanwords and TV Distinction. The dissertation includes the introduction, 3 chapters, bibliography, and illustrations. The first chapter includes 3 parts. The first part of the first chapter is an introduction which provides with some historical reference on how Hebrew was used in Europe, in Eastern Europe and in Russian Empire in the indicated time span. The second part of the first chapter is a research of how Hebrew is being encompassed now in scholarly tradition and what are the new focuses that I suggest as a result of my research. The third chapter refers to some specific linguistic examples. So the chapters 2 and 3 are about pure linguistics. May I now focus on each of the chapters in more detail. So the first chapter is the theoretical part. Well, today we have the following concepts of how to understand the history of Hebrew. On the one hand, we have a traditional approach, and this is the perspective according to the traditional approach. At the biblical times, Hebrew was a vernacular language, but then it was a dead language for over 2,000 years. And then, at the beginning of the 19th century, it was reinstituted, which was the major contribution of Eliezer ben Yehuda. This is the traditional interpretation, which is not seriously treated by experts in Hebraic studies. Therefore, there is a desire to establish a new concept. The possible solutions are as follows. It is impossible to claim that a dead language, a language that is never spoken, that is never known, such a dead language cannot be promoted into a vernacular, into plenipotential vernacular national language that would cover all the domains of a proper living language. Therefore, we have to interpret contemporary Hebrew as a new language. And this is the most common knowledge today. But I would like to outline one common feature for all of the approaches. This common feature is the dichotomy between a dead and a living language. All the approaches proceed from the fact that in the 19th century this was a dead language, or it was not used as a spoken language. What I do is to analyze the very concept of a dead language, starting from the time of its origination all over to its promotion to a vernacular. The concept of a dead language emerged in Italy in the epoch of Renaissance. Some representatives of Italian Renaissance wanted to improve the status, the title of vernacular languages, and therefore to oppose vernacular languages to Latin was this term established. Then, in universities, in European universities, the triad of three languages, Latin, Old Greek, and Hebrew, has consolidated. And this is how this concept of a dead language expands to encompass the rest two languages. In the 19th century, we had the Jewish Enlightenment movement, the so-called Haskalah, when some concepts of European culture were expanded so as to cover some Hebraic concepts. The general understanding was that Hebrew was a dead language. When we started to speak about choices of national language, a passionate debate emerged. May I now conclude on the first chapter? To my mind, a dead language is a term that emerged as a result of open debates, public debates, not scholarly debates. So this is a political term, not a scholarly term, and therefore irrelevant to describe Hebrew of the 19th century. What I suggest is to view the history of Hebrew of that time from the point of view of two ideas. This is the transition from a polylingual society to a monolingual society, and the opposition between Hebrew and Yiddish. The second chapter is devoted to the analysis of press in Hebrew. First and foremost, I look at the forms of loanwords adaptation of European vocabulary. Now I would like to underscore the two conclusions that I managed to arrive at in the second chapter. First conclusion, the key forms of adaptation were consolidated by the end of the 19th century in European Hebrew and not in Palestine, where we had the process of nativization. Therefore, we cannot relate these forms of loanwords adaptation to nativization. Second, when we look at spelling, we see that there is a dissipation of diglossy between Yiddish and Hebrew. The loanwords of the 60s and 50s of the 19th century, the spelling becomes very different. In the third chapter, I include texts that are close to spoken language, spoken dialogues, and vernacular. And that was possible. I was lucky to find textbooks of Russian language written in Hebrew in the 19th century. So the primary goal of these textbooks was to teach Russian to speakers of Hebrew. These textbooks are suffused with vernacular dialogues. What we have is 120 pages of dialogues with parallel texts in Russian and Hebrew. Those are quite daily dialogues, and I mentioned the key topics in my dissertation. Then I outlined some key linguistic feature of the language. And suddenly I noticed that forms of polite address are expressed in the third form of pronoun. It's like when we use the V form in Russian, and this is practically very similar to the TV distinction in Russian. But in Hebrew, they had to choose between the second and the third person. I had to check my preliminary conclusion in the collections of letters. And this is what I saw in the collection of letters as well. And thanks to my research supervisor, it dawned on me that this polite address is still exists, but in very secluded landscapes, in religious landscapes and contexts. And I managed to prove this information. And therefore, we could come up with another challenge. How come that a dead language was able to establish the forms of polite address and to revitalize them? And how come that contemporary grammars of Hebrew do not mention such forms? May I now, to wrap up, mention the key conclusions, which are as follows. Hebrew was much more prominent in the 19th century than it is thought to be. So it expanded beyond fiction or written language. Key mechanisms of innovations were not related to nativization and were absorbed thanks to the contacts with European languages. And today, we could suspect that Hebrew indeed was used as a vernacular language. The term of a dead language is incompatible with Hebrew of the 19th century, and therefore I suggest to view the history of Hebrew as a transition from a multilingual to a monolingual society. Thank you. Thank you very much, distinguished colleagues, members of the dissertation panel. Do you have any questions to the defendant? If there are no questions, now we proceed on to reviews. May I remind you that the dissertation panel has come up with reviews provided by all the 5 members of the defense panel. All of the reviews are in compliance with the decree 9250/1 and are downloaded to the website of St. Petersburg State University. Mr. Zholtov, may I give you the floor and remind you that you have no more than 10 minutes. Distinguished colleagues, may I inform you on the key provisions of my review. The dissertation by Sonya Yampolskaya is an independent and a well-structured research which is devoted to 3 interrelated aspects that correspond to the 3 chapters of the dissertation. The first chapter is the review of the history of Hebrew. It includes lots of sources and analysis. This problem focuses on the dichotomy of a living and a dead language. It is obvious that the analysis of discussion around this dichotomy is an important issue for the defendant. It is the backbone of the research. The second and the third chapters refer to linguistic analysis of specific examples which demonstrate the forms of loanwords adaptation and the TV distinction development. The analysis is very solid. The defendant pays a lot of attention to some innovative, specific features of Hebrew that have never been in the scholarly tradition. This is an adequate and a solid approach which allows us to expand our discussion on the status of Hebrew. The most important thing is the analysis of polite forms of address in the third person. The dissertation has a lot of innovative ideas. It is done in the best academic scholarly tradition. This allows us to claim that the dissertation by Sonya Yampolskaya is in full compliance with the prerequisites for the PhD granting. However, as a reader, I have to be critical. Therefore, may I inform you on some corrections that the objective of these corrections is not to undervalue Madam Yampolskaya's research. The key objective of the author is to deprive this magic revitalization process of its mythical nature. And actually, the defendant is successful in her objective. Revitalization is a continuum of Hebrew development in Eastern Europe. I believe that the very term of diglossia is very relevant to describe Hebrew in the relevant time span, and thus manages to offer a successful explanation to the processes as well as to expand our background knowledge on Hebrew history. I agree with the defendant that the dichotomy between dead and living languages is not the most successful mode of description, not because all the connotations of the very word a dead language, with its reference to languages that had provided an enormous impact on European and global culture. I believe that scientifically, what is important is the very insufficiency of these two terms. Usually when we have only a binary opposition, it is very difficult to adjust those two to the variety of phenomena. This dichotomy of the dead and the living makes us squeeze the variety of linguistic phenomena into these limits, whereas what we indeed have is a complicated continuum, because the very border between the living and the dead is far more discrete than it is presented. Languages have a different degree of being dead or being living. Latin is studied in grammar schools, universities. Latin has its audience, but no one speaks Latin as a vernacular, and there are no such groups who could speak Latin at the age of 3 or at the age of 4 and could naturally accumulate it. Other languages may be deprived of any written tradition, but for the members of this community, this would be their first native language, acquired in the childhood. This is what makes living languages very similar, but languages are dead in a different manner. However, there are lots of challenges. Is it a living language for children, or is it a living language for the elderly? Hittite, or Latin, a Coptic language, or Old Greek, which is mentioned, which is used in religious procedures, is usually characterized by a multitude of forms. Therefore, every language analyzed would possess its typological differential features, like a child language, its reproducibility, or its limits, whether it is used in religious processions or not. Based on this dissertation, we could conclude that Hebrew in the Eastern Europe of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, had all the features of a living language, but for one, being the child language. Now we know that in the state of Israel, there are lots of children who have acquired Hebrew as their first language in their childhood. And therefore, my question, what allowed children to speak and to acquire a language that was not the native language for their parents? Why did it happen in Israel and not in the Eastern Europe? May I share some conclusions in this respect? This process is well known for sociolinguistics. This is the process of pidgin conversion into a Creole language, which means that people with different background, different linguistic background, are united into one community. And this is what allowed Jews to integrate as a single community. What we have is higher genres, written genres, or religious language being integrated in the situation of a diglossia. Yampolskaya shows quite insistently that diglossia was very specific, was very common at that times, with Yiddish and Hebrew used. I believe that this is not a step towards revitalization, but towards creolization, but not of the pidgin, but the common registers. This situation of moral integrity of Jews promoted this process. Therefore, the situation with Hebrew is indeed a unique phenomenon. Such an example of creolization is indeed extraordinary, but it is not magic. It is a natural process. Creolization should not be treated as a concept of an emergence of a new language. Creole language is not a new language. It is the language that has not been native, but it managed to become native for the next generation. Therefore, I cannot find any typological examples, similar examples of such a phenomenon. But hypothetically, we could imagine a group of people who would immigrate into different linguistic landscapes. Such a diglossia could have emerged. And then there would be a challenge of a common linguistic code. So the challenge of a spoken vernacular language of the majority, provided there is some impetus for self-identification and moral integrity, I believe that in this respect Yiddish was a marker of European Jewish integrity, but it could not be functional in Israel. The other correction refers to the absence of some tools, some linguistic tools, like glosses. it would have been more comfortable to see some short information on the paradigm of personal pronouns in Hebrew, or to have glosses of examples. However, in some examples, for example, on page 114, 116, the author forgets about readers who are not well informed about Hebrew. However, the innovative nature of this research is not undervalued despite of these corrections. The complicated relations between Yiddish and Hebrew in different institutions and communities are very well presented in the research, but in two cases the author got confused by this complicacy. May I quote? This was a magazine in Hebrew, but then later in the text, the author calls this same magazine as a Yiddish magazine. So we start with Hebrew and we wrap up with Yiddish, which is somehow controversial. The same thing happens with the following quote. May I note that all experts in Yiddish agree with this statement, as well as experts in Hebrew. But overall, the language is very eloquent, and it is easy to read this paper. However, there are some wordings that seem to be unlucky to me. For example, the political fight between Zionists and Hebraists, which provoked this deadly clash between the two languages. I think this deadly clash is not a successful term. Or, for example, to impose scholarly pronunciation onto reality. I think this wording is not accurate. Well, to wrap up, I would like to say that terminology is well, and I would like to focus only on one correction. This is the term glide. I believe that it is not the overall diphthong in the word August is the glide, but only the second part of the diphthong, which is the glide. But all these corrections underscore how relevant and how important this paper is. The dissertation by Sonya Yampolskaya on the topic under the title is presented in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, Candidate of Sciences in the relevant subject, and Sonya Yampolskaya deserves PhD granting in subject 10.02.22. Thank you. Madam Yampolskaya, you can take the floor after all the reviews. Distinguished colleagues, now we have the full representation of the dissertation panel. Mr. Franzusov, now the floor is yours. But before you take the floor, may I underline that you have a very elaborate review, but may I remind you of the time limit. So no more, please do not exceed the time limit of 10 minutes. Make it as a short. Well, 10 minutes is too short. I would like it to be 15. Please do not extend the 15 minutes time limit. Well, I could make it shorter. Well, lastly, it has been spoken a lot on preservation of scholarly traditions and schools, but science and academic tradition starts where we have some disintegration between these traditions. Well, I started to study Hebrew as a student. Many stereotypes. May I mention I studied the Hebrew variety of Israel. But I had to get rid of many stereotypes that I was used to. It is great that the author is very well informed both on Hebrew and Yiddish, which is a rare thing today, because Yiddish is rather a dead language than a vernacular today. And this is what ensured this high academic profile of this research. The first chapter informs us on the sociolinguistic nature of this research. First and foremost, it focuses on the life of the Eastern European Jews and underscores the importance of Haskalah and the Jewish Enlightenment that promoted the Jewish culture in Russia. The key statement for Chapter 1 is the very concept of Hebrew and Yiddish diglossia with the reference to Arabic dialects and demotics, as well as the eruption of its borders. The Chernovitsky Conference, as of 1908, has not solved the problem, but it has underscored the debate between Yiddish and Hebrew. May I underscore that the author of the paper is very well informed on Yiddish and Hebrew, both, which is a rare thing. So the Bolshevik Jews and their activities resulted in assimilationists. The dramatic history of Gabimo theater was indeed dramatic when this Hebrew theater had to go away on an endless tour abroad in January 1926. The section 2.2 is closely related to Chapter 1, and here we see that the two stages in the history of Hebrew, the Maskil stage and the Israeli stage, cannot be separated from each other. The defendant retrospectively demonstrates the inconsistency of the notion of a dead language, which refers to the official Zionist myth of the Hebrew revival by Eliezer ben Yehuda, as if it were a non-Semitic language. In Chapter 2, the development of forms of loanwords adaptation, and in the Hebrew, the author concentrates on the dissipation of the diglossia between Yiddish and Hebrew. The key point example is linguistic examples from the Garonne newspaper, which was edited in 1917-1918 in Moscow. The defendant looks at the spelling tradition in Garonne and on the tradition that it was not the end ein that was used in 1960-1980, but with hey on the opposite for the feminine. Here, Yampolskaya focuses on the very important pronunciation tradition, the Ashkenaz tradition and the Sfaragite tradition. And this is how the author manages to do away with the traditional stereotype. According to this stereotype, the Ashkenazi pronunciation emerged later and reflects the phonetics of Indo-European languages. But the author refers to Garonne experience and refers to the reconstruction of the phonetic system of Hebrew as well as on the inspector of the Villain Hebrew Institute and the translation of the Torah into Russian, which was the only book that was sold in synagogues in the Soviet Union. And it is still a very good translation. Though this topic is beyond the scope of the research, it reflects the vast knowledge of the author to support Steinberg's idea, which should compare this phenomena with what we have in Syrian languages, in Syrian phonology, the Western Syrian and the Eastern Syrian pronunciation. The conclusion is that in Garonne, foreign words are combined according to the norm that has not been yet there in its full degree in Hebrew of that time. In chapter 3, we have a system of the TV distinction with a specific focus on the third form, singular, masculine and feminine, in polite addresses. The author refers to the 3 collections of letters as of the 16th century and is able to prove that it was not a borrowing neither from the 16th nor from the 18th century. The main advantage of this research is the fact that some specific areas in Jerusalem that still preserve these polite forms of address are indeed unique. As in every research, this dissertation is not exempt of criticism. The most important criticism refers to the Ashkenazi and Sepharad forms of pronunciation. The relevant bibliography refers to the Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian Polish norms. It would have been more correct to review this subject in the very introduction, but not in the second chapter, without leaving any open questions. So the relevant place by Bialik, who wrote in Ashkenaz variety, does that mean that those were performed in Sferagat? What was the language of Shlapin when he performed the hymn of Israel? If we do away with the Ashkenazi variety of pronunciation, does that mean that, as it is claimed on page 160, why is it that the Benzion Emirovich Grante looks at Bialik's poem and transcribes it in according to the modern Israeli pronunciation? If we start with such questions, we see that some of them have no answer. And this identifies the limits of our knowledge and the absence of our knowledge as well. It is very difficult to look at the opposition between the Zionism and socialism, specifically if we take into consideration this powerful socialist component. We should be very careful in our discretion between Zionism of socialists and imperialists and the Bolsheviks. On page 36, the author manages the decree of the press committee as of August 13, 1990. And on page 38, the author mentions that there were no official documents on the fact that Hebrew language was banned. How should we understand this? page 37, Soviet censorship prevented any import of literature in Hebrew. But we have data that contradict this fact. Indeed, out of 24 publications in Hebrew, 22 were banned and 68 were banned in Yiddish out of 79 overall. But if we look at percentages, we come up with the fact that the Soviet censorship passed 1 out of 10 Yiddish publications, whatever language it was published in. It is not accurate to claim that the Jewish section of the Soviet government, after it had did away with the Gabima theater, has started a new epoch. And we cannot imagine the fact that Stalin has become the father of Semitism in the former USSR. And all this means that these are the events that are behind the fact that Mikhail's name was included into the Soviet culture. There is some mix-up in Italian names. Italian idioti is not lay people, but those are people who live in a private life. Then two Italian words, originale and non-originale, articolare or non-articolare, is not accurately translated. A more accurate translation would be preliminary or secondary. The adjective Ottoman is not Osmanian, but it is an Ottoman province. So that Russian translation is inaccurate. On page 146, we have polite forms in German language that emerged in 16th century, and on page 150, those emerged in the 17th century. On page 35, we see the positions of Dimmerstein, and on page 121, once again, the author mentions who Dimmerstein was, with only first position mentioned. Translations from Hebrew are not accurate always, like the translation of Kol Mevaser. Haaretz is not accurately translated because it is the land of Israel and not land. The relevance of the research should be included into the beginning, but not into the end of the dissertation. I'm not the speaker of English and not fluent in English, therefore I cannot conclude whether the English translation is accurate. But quite often what we see is not the translation, but just a free interpretation of the Russian original. Now, this is the first defense which is done under the new decree, and we should stipulate the order of English translation as well. However, in English translation there are some mistakes. For example, of instead of, or in the description of Sergei Volkonsky, the word dogs is omitted. It is strange that the English transcription of Dimmerstein is spelled with SH instead of ST, which would be more regular, like Epstein. In conclusion, may I inform you on my full satisfaction on this dissertation. The dissertation by Sonya Yampolskaya is in full compliance with the Decree 6821/1 as of September 1st, 2016, on the PhD granting procedures in Petersburg State University, and Sonya Yampolskaya deserves the degree of Doctor of Philosophy Candidate of Sciences in subject 10/02/22. Thank you very much, Mr. Franzusov. May I now give the floor to Arkady Kovelman, Doctor of History, Professor, Head of Judaic Studies Department at the Institute of Asia and Africa, Moscow State University. Dear colleagues, good afternoon. I'm sorry that I'm not able to present among you physically. May I not read out my review, and I would like to distinguish between oral and written discourse. So I will just make a short speech or a summary of my review. Why do I like this dissertation? It has the very important component of a research. It is an opportunity, it is an attempt to find a solution between a number of contradictions, a number of challenges. What we see is the deconstruction of the contemporary stereotype in sociolinguistics. The sociolinguistic concept is a myth, and this is what the defendant shows, the myth of dead or living languages. A language cannot be dead, it cannot be living. This very myth goes back to Dante and to all the dialogues that mention the difference between dead and living languages. And I would like to quote. The dialogue claims that the dead texts behave like statues. And then we can proceed on to nomos and all that we can see in the distinctions between the dead and the living language. But instead, Yampolskaya offers the term of diglossia. And thus refers to texts of the 20th century, vernacular texts, which describe two languages as an integral, single language. The distinction between a higher register and a lower register, and therefore all the paradoxes and therefore Hebrew and Yiddish as a daily language. What happened in the 20th century is the dissipation of diglossia, its disintegration. And I would like to refer a marvelous fairy tale, Ben Yudu, and Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who looks like a magic hero who suddenly appears and revives a language. and releases his kind of children to become language, the language of Israel. So this is what we see, the disintegration of diglossia, and there are all sorts of reasons, both internal and external, and all of them were mentioned today. My understanding is that what Sonya Yampolskaya did is highly relevant, and we can prove the relevance by the processes that happened in Judaic society after the antiquity. It was the triglossia, with the Talmud, the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud. Usually when we refer to those, we distinguish between Yiddish and Aramaic. But this is a one integral language. There were higher registers and lower registers. And the third language is Greek, which functioned as a language in towns. And it can be present in medrashes. And the same thing happened in Pomerania. The Middle Babylonian language as a vernacular and there are lots of words that still remained dating back to that period. So every time what we see is the disintegration of diglossia. After the Arabic invasion, for example, this is indeed, and here I agree with the first speaker, here we see how unique the behavior of languages can be, what a unique behavior languages can demonstrate. But this later diglossia is different from what we see in the 19th century. I mean, the diglossia of the Latin, because there are no ethnic centers, with all of them merging together. In conclusion, I would like to mention that this dissertation is in full compliance with all the prerequisites for the PhD granting, and Sonya Yampolskaya deserves the PhD granting, Candidate of Sciences in the relevant subject. Thank you very much, Mr. Professor Kovelman. Now may I give the floor to Professor Karen Dubnov, Doctor of Linguistics, PhD in Linguistics at Hebrew University at Jerusalem, Research Secretary at the Hebrew Language Academy, Israel. Madam Dubnov, do you hear us? Let's try again. Distinguished colleagues, well, we have some interruption here. We have some problems with the connection. May I now then, instead of Madam Dubnov, declare my review? Well, the very phenomenon of Hebrew represents the unique phenomenon of revolution and relates to a complex collection of factors, both intralinguistic and extralinguistics. And this is what motivates the relevance of the topic. Yampolskaya focuses on new phenomena that have never been in the focus of the scholarly tradition, which allows her to come up with some important theoretical conclusions. The innovation is that she refers to very innovative linguistic material, including press and textbooks, that date back to the 19th and early 20th century. In her research, Madame Yampolskaya offers the evolution of language in diachrony, and which allows us to look at both internal and extra-linguistic factors. The defendant shows that Hebrew was being developed both in rural areas and in cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg. She also refers to the history of Hebrew in the Middle Ages and the tradition of its study. There is a thorough analysis of press and linguistic material, but unfortunately we don't have any information on the number of issues per each newspaper. This could give us some more information on the scope of audience. The author shows very well the process of loanwords adaptation, both in spelling and in pronunciation, the variety of spelling, and consistently looks at how the vocabulary of Hebrew started to consolidate. The author has very well linguistic tools and is very well informed on terminology. The very objective to review and to subvert the existing stereotypes actually were a success, and therefore this dissertation can be recommended to anyone who is interested in interference of extra-linguistical factors. Therefore, the simultaneous existence of Hebrew and Yiddish and this diglossia can be viewed as a model for existence of typologically close systems, including the Arabic linguistic continuum, and this was very remarkable for me. This paper has a lot of advantages. However, there are some points for criticism, including technical aspects and mistakes. There is no consistency in referring to personal names. Some names are referred in full, the name and the last name, but others have only the initials. For example, historians A. Holtzman, M. Gilboyle, Pushkin, Shakespeare, and Shalapin have no initials at all. And it is actually unclear to me what is the author guided by in such reference to personal names. Now the bibliography is inconsistent. The first-person narrative could be well substituted for the first-person plural narrative. There are some problems with the text formats. Page 10, for example. Fonts are sometimes unsuccessfully used, or some inconsistent expressions or phrases like kindergartens in Hebrew. I think kindergartens where children communicated in Hebrew are meant. Sometimes Cyrillic and Latin is mixed up. There are no tables and no transliteration or transcription. It's not quite clear, well, to me at least, such phrases, what is meant under such phrases of the interest to Judaic languages of the Great Inquisitor of the Spanish Church. If we speak about Spanish or about Yiddish and Hebrew, then what does it have to do with Christ? And the data, the Arabic language as an official language of six countries, I think this number, the 6 countries, is a little bit over-exaggerated. Quotations are quite inconsistent. But what is alarming to me is the statement on the fact that there was a relevant law in the USSR that Hebrew was banned. But what can you reply if you know that Hebrew was actually taught in 1940s at the Hebraic Studies Department at St. Petersburg University, on with the solid tradition of Hebrew studies in 1960s, 1970s, and there was no interruption in Hebrew studies. And there was a whole continuum that has never been interrupted. However, all these critical aspects cannot undervalue the very success, and I can claim truly that Sonya Yampolskaya's dissertation on features of European Hebrew development in the 19th, early 20th century, loanwords and TV distinction, is in full compliance with the key prerequisites of the decree as of September 1st, 2016 on the PhD granting procedure at St. Petersburg State University, and Sonya Yampolskaya deserves the PhD granting Candidate of Sciences in Subject 10-0222 Languages of Foreign Nations of Europe, Asia, Africa, Aborigines of America and Australia, Hebrew. Thank you very much for your attention. Colleagues, have we successfully established our online connection with Madam Dubnov? Yes, okay. Madam Dubnov, the floor is yours. I'm not going to read my review, which is on paper. Do you hear me? Do you hear me well? Yes, we do. So I represent Israeli academic tradition. I know lots of works on Hebrew revival, on the Jewish Enlightenment, hundreds of these papers, but all of them refer to the revival of Hebrew in Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century, or they try to get rid with this magic revitalization myth. Or, differently, they attempt to establish a different concept and claim that this was a new language, an entirely new language, either based on some other European language or an entirely different new language. And there are no works, no papers that somehow oppose living or dead language, and this is what makes this research paper so innovative. Another innovative aspect is the choice of linguistic examples. Those are the Garonne newspaper that is very rarely mentioned in the Israeli scholarly tradition. So there are hardly any papers that would refer to these newspapers or collections of letters or textbooks of Russian language written in Hebrew. Actually, it is quite recently that such textbooks started to be analyzed and reported at conferences, primarily in St. Petersburg. In Israel, those debates are so rare. As for spelling, this is another neglected dimension, the dimension that has been neglected by Haskalah experts. I think 2.5 of them those are who I know. Some of them are not from Israel. They have never analyzed spelling diachronically, only synchronically. As for the forms of polite address, I think that this is just some specific and independent area to be studied to find out to what extent Hebrew was used as a vernacular. This paper does away with the concept of dead and living languages because this very concept proceeds from the fact of an integral language, which is not true for a natural linguistic environment. I believe that this paper would be very valuable for Israel and will be translated not into English only but in Hebrew as well, because it can change, it can enhance many statements, many stereotypes in Israeli academic tradition. There is one drawback that I want to mention. You mention the textbook of Russian language, and there you claim that daily vocabulary is said to be new, is said to have new origins and new roots, and does not date back to Middle Age culture. But it turns out that this textbook has so many words that are neologisms, and it seems to me that this aspect is key, this vocabulary is key for this dissertation. Once you have it published as a book, I would like that you expand on this aspect and focus more on such new words, neologisms. Provided there is a broader overview of this aspect, then you would be able to prove your conclusion from various approaches, because daily vocabulary is key. However, this is not criticism, although it's a heavy drawback. So, what I mean is that there is some perspective to improve your research, but it does not undermine all your conclusions, and definitely the defendant deserves the PhD, the Doctor of Philosophy degree, candidate of sciences, and the dissertation is in full compliance with all the prerequisites. Thank you so much. Sophia, please, your reply to all the criticism. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to all the members of the dissertation panel for their highly valuable statements and their contribution. May I focus more on some of the critical positions. May I start with Mr. Franzusov's review. As for the Ashkenazi pronunciation norm, this is what I look at in the second chapter. So I decided not to expand on this topic here because it would have been too complicated. As for the dialect, the Ashkenazi dialect, those are deemed to be the same number as the Yiddish dialects. There are three key dialects: Lithuanian, Polish, and Ukrainian dialects, and other sub-dialects. But I should say that there was insufficient scholarly tradition in this respect. At the beginning of the century, there is some ample research, as well as there are some works that date back to the latest 2 decades. But if we look at a specific poem, we would find something which has never been described. And this is what we have usually. So the scholarly tradition is insufficient to be able to read and interpret poetic texts in full. May I focus on the example from Grandi, This is the very beginning of the Benek's poet. If you try to read this transcription, you can see that there are rhymes, but there's no meter. So I can read the first two verses. If we read it in Ashkenazi pronunciation, this is going to be Yambus. So Grandy selected such an abstract where all rhymes are perfect, but if we change the dialect, we get rid of all the rhymes. I don't know what's the reason behind that. There is a poem, there is the transcription, it's syllabotonics without any stresses. I don't know what's the reason behind that. Well, highly exciting questions on Gebima, whether it is Ashkenazi, Shalapin, kindergartens. I don't have any solid answer in this respect, and no one has such an answer. There are some such suppositions, and in these suppositions I proceed from two facts. In Eastern Europe, in Eastern Russia, Ashkenazi pronunciation was very well spread, but the Ashkenazi norm starts to change. I was unable to find this in archives. I didn't find the record of Shalapin's performance of Hatikva, but I managed to find a similar performance that dates back to the second decade of the 20th century. The same thing stands for kindergartens. I can just suggest, based on what I found about kindergartens, that child verse were in Ashkenazi tradition, but what we had in reality was a mixed norm, but I cannot claim that for sure. So the translation of Bialik, can we proceed from the fact that this is Ashkenazi as well? This is just a preliminary conclusion, but no one can come up with answers. But anyway, thank you very much for the question. Everything that refers back to the historical criticism, historical inaccuracies, well, I accept all of those. Thank you so much. As for the translation, here I also accept most of them, but not all of them. As for Spironi and Idioti, this paper was written in the 16th century, and I don't think that this is important to use the old semantics here, because idiot in the 16th century meant a lay person. And here we can see irony. And may I quote, "We as lay person do allow us to use our jargon language." So here what we see the opposition of Latin, the Latin of the educated people, and jargon, vernacular jargon of lay people, common people. And I think that lay people is the best translation here. As for articulare, well, I disagree that what we mean here is this. I believe that this idea of articulation, articulare is not about articulation, it's about putting something into order. Because what Italian scholars meant is that there are vernacular languages without grammar, and there are languages, written languages with grammar. As for Kol Mevasser, the voice of joy, may I not agree, and in my disagreement may I refer to the relevant verse. Samuel 1:4-17. So both your sons, Ofni and Phineas, died. So I believe this is not the joy. I believe that it is the mission. As for the country, well, the country, this is country but not land. As for Dimmenstein and the spelling of Dimmenstein, well, initially I wrote this, spelled it in German tradition, but I decided finally to refer to Yegov Encyclopedia, and I believe that this is one of the most authoritative sources in English. This is an encyclopedia in English. It is written by top experts, and it is a solid reference, a solid source. Maybe I use it unjustly, but this is something what I can refer to. May I now proceed on to Mr. Zholtov's review? I would like to focus on this debate of Creole languages. As Karen Dubnov said, there is such a research by Shalomon Israel who expands this topic and mentions the fact that contemporary Hebrew can be interpreted as a Creole language. Well, of course, Hebraists did not accept that, but Creolists did not accept his research as well, which is not good. I believe that the complicated thing is that a Creole language is emergence of a new language. Creolization is not nativization. It is not acquisition of a language as a native one. Creole language must have some very specific structural properties which make it different from the pidgin language of the parents. But we cannot change the theory of Creole language. Both Creole languages and pidgin languages, as in my understanding, cannot be extracted from the theory. You cannot interpret it without a theory. And they indeed have some similar common structural components, but once the nativization happens, the structure of the language has to change, has to transform. Pidgin English is not English. It is very different structurally from what we have in English. But in Hebrew, we see a continuum between the language of the 19th and the 20th century. And this is how we can claim that this was diglossic if we manage to prove the fact that the older written Hebrew is the origin of the forthcoming vernacular Hebrew. But I don't know such attempts. And thank you very much for touching upon this topic. It is highly exciting. I would like to provide a response to Mr. Redkin's review. As for personal names, I believe that Pushkin or Shalapin cannot be mixed up with anyone, so I believe the reader would understand it. When I refer to some new authors, I usually write their names in full. You mean Aramaic and Hebrew? Aramaic, from inside of Judaic culture, was considered a dead language. Well, there were some more interesting statements, but, thank you very much. I accept all of them. Thank you very much to Arcade, Karen. Thank you very much for your statements, for your contribution. I indeed did not look into neologisms. Thank you very much for the reference to and Plato dialogues. It is a matter for me to have a think. Distinguished colleagues, any other those who would like to take the floor? May I now give the floor to the research supervisor, Simon Michelson. Distinguished colleagues, as a research supervisor, I should not speak about the advantages of this research, because when the supervisor signs the dissertation, this is how supervisors normally assess the research value, the academic value of the paper. Indeed, this is a festivity for my soul, because it is incompatible with my understanding of Hebrew that has been with me for over 30 years. When I started to study Hebrew at the beginning of the 1970s, I was absolutely torn away from Israeli traditions. And those were the Haskalah books. I wrote Anna Karenina in the first translation. I read Jules Verne in Hebrew. But later, when I was introduced to the idea of a dead language, it has always interfered with my understanding of this language. But Perelman, and who later became the Ben Yehuda, did a lot for the promotion of the development of Hebrew. But what I always wanted to do is to subvert the stereotype. And I believe that this is a highly relevant research. I'm so happy that this has happened at our young Department of Hebraic Studies. This is our second dissertation, a very solid and a valuable dissertation. I am so much proud of our successes, and I hope that we will be able to publish this dissertation as a book. Well, I should also say, personally on my behalf, that for many years I worked with the Jewish Theological Seminary of the United States of America. And I was an invited professor, and I was always addressed in third person. There was another phenomenon. There was hardly any rabbin who could say a long phrase in one language. They all spoke in several languages. They started in Hebrew when talking with me, then they went on to English and wrapped it up in Yiddish. And it was impossible to get rid of this triglossia. And my last statement, and I'm so excited in how it is all comes together. An American rabbin called me today. We had a talk in Hebrew, in Sephardic pronunciation, and I told him that today I was going to have this defense of a highly exciting dissertation. And this is what he said. But once he started to pray, his pronunciation transformed into the Ashkenazi tradition. It's highly exciting. They speak in Sephardi pronunciation, but they pray in Ashkenazi pronunciation. And now I also pray in Ashkenazi pronunciation. So there are so many open questions. There are so many challenges in front of us, but this is indeed a marvelous start of a large research. I have a large perspective, and therefore my congratulations. Thank you very much, Professor Yampolskaya. And now it is time for us to have a 5-minute break to discuss the results of the defense. May I now ask all the audience to leave us for 5 minutes and to wait behind the doors. Thank you.
Нет, открытое голосование поименное. Регламент, да, регламент требует, да, это у нас тайное совещание. Да.
Хорошо. Да так меня будет слышно, что? Полагаете, что меня будет не слышно? Ага. Ну, прекрасно.
Дабы тайна совещания была соблюдена, сейчас последние гости покидают зал. Уважаемые коллеги, я надеюсь, мы сейчас будем совсем одни. И каково мнение относительно представленной диссертации? Пожалуйста.
Очень хорошая работа.
У меня есть предложение, так сказать.
Пожалуйста, в микрофон, чтобы все слышали.
У меня есть предложение, так сказать, проголосовать, поскольку все уже высказались.
Голосовать будем потом, после перерыва, да. Аркадий Бенционович, пожалуйста, я думаю, что...
Да, я уже высказал свое мнение. Работа прекрасна.
Прекрасно. Госпожа Дубнов, пожалуйста.
Я очень положительное мнение о работе. Я думаю, что это новое направление в случае в гебраистике, исторической социологии.
Я должен сказать, что я целиком и полностью поддерживаю выводы коллег, и, честно говоря, мне работа очень понравилась. Она читается легко, она вызывает интерес, и, ну, как специалисты, я думаю, будет интересно ее читать, так и не специалисту, или же специалистам из смежных специальностей, поэтому, ну, будем, вероятно, приглашать коллег и будем голосовать тогда. Голосование будет поименно. Я буду называть имена членов ученого совета.
Так голосуем мы при всех все-таки?
Да, при всех, безусловно. И вы будете тогда высказывать свой вердикт.
А мы просто да или нет, или надо еще оценку поставить?
Нет, 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 оценок не надо. Вы голосуете за, поддерживаете, либо не поддерживаете.
Хорошо, прекрасно.
Да.
Okay, distinguished colleagues, distinguished members of the dissertation panel, we proceed on to open voting by names. As Mr. Franzusov Your vote, I'm in favor. Professor Zoltov, I'm in favor. Professor Kovelman, in favor. Professor Dubnov, in favor. I'm in favor as well. I'm chairman of the dissertation panel. Distinguished colleagues, thus the dissertation by Sonya Yampolskaya, Some Features of European Hebrew Development in the 19th, early 20th century, Loanwords and TV Distinction, is presented in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, Candidate of Sciences in Subject 10.02.22 Languages of Foreign Nations of Europe, Asia, Africa, Aborigines of America and Australia, Hebrew, and was supported by the members of the dissertation panel. Thus, our congratulations on the PhD granting. May I remind you that this conclusion of the dissertation panel was unanimously accepted in case under the PhD granting procedure, no less than 2/3 of the members of the dissertation panel must vote in favor of the PhD granting. And thus we have the procedure was in compliance with all the prerequisites of the decree. Now, Madam Yampolskaya, the floor is yours. Your conclusive and closing words. May I extend my gratitude to all the members of the dissertation panel. I should say that I has been helped by many people within these 7 years that I have been focusing on this research. This is my research supervisor. This is my supervisor, Nikolai Vachtin, Professor Vachtin in European University, my professors, my teachers, Professor Redkin, people who taught me Judaics in the European University. I believe that European University and St. Petersburg State University are the two institutions that allowed me to expand my interests in the classical gymnasium. So I extend my gratitude to all my friends, my colleagues who are here, my teachers. Now may I ask everyone to come to the department and discuss and have some discussion on the margin. Unfortunately, I cannot invite members of the dissertation panel who are online with us to join us. Thank you so much. Distinguished colleagues, may I once again congratulate the defendant with the successful defense. The meeting of the dissertation panel is adjourned. Thank you.
Спасибо большое вам за участие.
So much for your participation.
Было очень приятно.
Тода раба.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Да.